Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and control measures used to orchestrate combat engagement and wars. Having been thinking about this for a while, I've developed a little theory. The hypothesis, right, is that command is human and control has become increasingly technological, I'm not sure. There are libraries filled with discussion and commentary about command, but very little about control. And given the growth in command and control systems in headquarters, I think we need to consider how we effectively synchronize between the key functions of command and control. Do we even understand why we put control measures into the C2 taxonomy a few decades ago anyway? My aim is to open up a conversation, since we haven't had serious debate about the control element since, well, maybe the 1980s. I'm Peter Roberts, your host, as we talk to people, operators, commanders, technical geniuses, academics, and those from industry who have been thinking about different aspects of C2 for a while, but the conversation hasn't really moved on yet. This series of the show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic are the creators of Citaware, the world's #1 C4 ISR software. We've designed C2 systems for the military since 1986 and supply more than 45 countries worldwide. With a heritage built on innovative development and rigorous testing, this is a proven in-service solution based on real customer requirement and tailored to fit your needs.
The Western style of command and control has evolved since the established formats of the 1980s, right? Since then, C2 has become somewhat of an industry and the size and scale of headquarters has increased markedly. Along with that change, so too has the ability to conduct dynamic control of the battle space. What do I mean by this? Right. On a very basic level, this meant that in Afghanistan, for example, the usual fire support coordination process and deconfliction lines were managed in real time, enabling a pace of strike operation previously not possible. It meant that gunships could conduct strikes on adversaries while shells and artillery rockets fired over them. And airborne assaults could arrive on the Dimpy seconds after the last shell landed. This has been possible because of ubiquitous communications and new technology that was able to provide detailed situational awareness to both commanders and operators. The system evolved slower than many would have liked, but enabled commanders to defer decisions as well, as the time known as last safe moment became stretched. And it also meant, according to people on the ground, that planning timelines were delayed as much more information was sought and assurances needed. It also meant that there was much less delegation to subordinate commanders in a fight. The centralization of command and control functions at headquarters became the norm, and the idea of mission command, that philosophy that seniors tell you what to do but not how to do it, mission command sort of withered. But Afghanistan and Iraq were a moment of time and less of a sophisticated adversary, right? This was about guys that rode horses and fired Second World War munitions. In Ukraine, a peer-on-peer conflict has been raging for 15 months now that shows just how different this type of warfare is. The significant jamming and communications are, patchy at best. The ideas of a connected force and of perfect situational awareness are less convincing given this experience. But how does that change command and control? Indeed, how have the Ukrainian General Staff been able to orchestrate battles under these conditions along a front that at one stage was nearly 2,500 kilometres long? To dive into this, I'm joined by Dr. Jack Watling, the Senior Research Fellow for Land Warfare at RUSI in London. Now, Jack's made numerous trips to Ukraine and has a level of insight that makes a valuable contribution to this discussion. But his experience is not just Ukraine, right? Jack covers all contemporary conflicts and as such comes with this discussion with a sense of perspective, I think, that many others don't have. Jack, welcome to the show. How about this for a first question? What's effective C2 and what does good look like?
So I think you can almost visualize the distinction by imagining somebody with a rifle. And if you are pointing and shooting that weapon yourself, you are controlling that weapon. If somebody else is holding it and you are trying to direct them to use it effectively, then you're exercising command. That's very simplistic, but if you think about the requirements necessary to do those two tasks well, they're completely different. Your ability to align and be precise and execute in a coordinated manner is critical. If you want to be steady doing it, it's critical to your shooting. Your ability to get somebody else to do what you want is about very, very clear, clean communication that delivers intent. And being clear requires you to be thought through and considered. There's that long running joke that I'm sorry that I wrote you a long letter, I didn't have time to write you a short one, right? Being concise and clear takes judgment and understanding of both the person that you're trying to direct, what happens if they speak a different language, and the effect that you want to deliver. And so I see command and control as actually very, very different functions. And the fact that we pull them together as a unified acronym and then sometimes pull other things like computers and all sorts of stuff into an expanded acronym actually leads to a lot of confusion. It's quite unhelpful.
I couldn't agree with all of that. I love the simplicity of what you're saying. It brings out the illustration of this beautifully. And yet, when we talk about modern battlefield, and you're talking about orchestration of effects rather than a single rifle, and you're including where people talk about multi-domain operations and integrated effects. We're talking about air-launched munitions. We're talking about sea-launched munitions coming from thousands, potentially thousands of miles away. We're talking about HIMARS. We're talking about artillery. And you're talking about it at divisional or even corps level on a huge front. That level of complexity that goes into the simple ideas of controlling someone else firing a rifle or commanding someone else to fire a rifle, does that change the definition at all, or is that just added complications?
I'm going to keep running with analogies because it's quite useful. You know the famous quote from Slim that the division is where you bring together the full orchestra of battle. And an orchestra is, I think, quite a good analogy for what you're trying to do. But in an orchestra, you have a couple of different things. Firstly, you have the music itself, the composition. And if you have time to write that out in immaculate detail, then fantastic. You can write a really detailed plan that essentially achieves control because everyone has their precise function laid out. In which case, the conductor is orchestrating the orchestra and everything's fine. But if you're in a dynamic environment where variables are changing and you've had to pull it together quickly, then actually what you give as the composition is probably closer to a jazz orchestra, right? People are improvising. They have to. You don't have time to write out detailed instructions for everyone. And at that point, where the conductor focuses their attention to dictate tempo or to specifically call on a particular instrument, they are exercising control. They are dedicating communication to that musician, but they can't control and direct everyone. And so then it becomes much more necessary that everyone understands what you're trying to achieve. And that requires you to trust your people, to have good instruments and good operators who know how to use their tools, understand your intent. So I think the problem with saying orchestra is that people think classical orchestra, whereas battle is far more dynamic than that. It's much more like a jazz orchestra.
Okay, I like that. I mean, there's been a number of these things about playing jazz before and freewheeling the music as it comes out, but falling back on some of that, those basics of rhythm and tempo and the occasional direction. That really works. Listen, what has got me is this comparison between perhaps how the West expected high-end warfare to play out in terms of command and control and the realities of Ukraine. And there are lots of people who have been drawing lessons about command and control from Ukraine. But as I understand, the Ukrainian general staff were pretty much all schooled in almost Soviet ways of doing things. So they had a bit of Western education afterwards, but it was very much, they were inculcated with a Soviet way of doing things and a very different way of command and control. So we ended up with the Ukrainian general staff commanding in a very different way, executing command and control in a very different way than many Western visitors were used to. And this led to a situation in which we couldn't sort of recognize what a brigade staff was. We couldn't see a divisional staff. We didn't know where the corps was sitting. It became a very flat structure, right? And that, I think, has somehow morphed. Could you talk us a little bit through that, about how the Ukrainians were set up at the start and then perhaps how they evolved?
So the Ukrainian military was set up in a couple of different ways at the beginning. Firstly, you had the Joint Forces Operations Area, which was a fixed bounded area where they had established defense lines from 2015. And there were hardened C2 nodes. And the 10 brigades that were manning that line were the ones that had received the most training and support from the international community. Many of them had served outside of Ukraine, in Iraq and Sierra Leone and elsewhere. And when you went into their headquarters, it felt quite a lot like a NATO headquarters, to be honest. And it's interesting that on the 15th of February last year, General Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, basically said, look, I can't guarantee that I can tell you when the war started because C2 may well can be completely disrupted. So exercise your own judgment. Ukrainian air defense was given permission to fire on its own authorities because they knew that when Russian planes came from the Sea of Azov, they'd get 3 minutes warning, and they anticipated that the communications links to those units would be jammed or denied. And so that bit felt quite Western, I suppose, from that tradition. However, at the same time, there was a massive general mobilization. In fact, they were so desperate for personnel on the Kiev axis, because the Russians had achieved surprise on the Gomel axis, that they mobilized all of the colonels in the general staff into a battalion of colonels. They subsequently distributed those officers either back into the general staff or to take command of new units. But for the first month, you had this battalion of colonels roving around with a lot of NLAWs. And they also brought a lot of people back into the service who had been trained under the Soviet system and hadn't had that 8 years of experience of working with partners. And so, yes, they still had a very Soviet approach. And it's worth noting that Soviet language for this activity is very different. Interestingly, Ukrainians say mission command when they're talking in English. And when they translate it into Ukrainian, they usually translate it as combat management, which is the Soviet term. And it looks very, very different. And so since then, you've had this iterative development of their C2 system. I can talk you through it if you like now, but I'd be talking for quite a while. So do you want to break it up, or do you want me to?
No, go for it. I'm fascinated by this idea.
Okay, sure. So initially what you had was groups of forces, and a commander was assigned a group of forces, which was the C2 hub that owned all joint assets for a sector. And so you would have Northern Defense Sector, Eastern Defense Sector, Southern Defense Sector, etc. And each of these sectors would then be assigned brigades and independent elements. They were using brigade headquarters, but actually what they found was that each brigade had reserve units that would be mobilized. And so they'd be in two different places. You would have the brigade's reserve units in one place and its starting position at the beginning of the war. And then they worked out they needed to do unit rotation. So what you ended up with is actually groups of forces commanders being assigned battalions. And so each group of force commander would have brigades, force generating battalions. They would formulate those into tactical groups, which are essentially brigade structures with an awful lot of enablement. And they would be assigned battle space that they were responsible for. And these tactical groups would be given code names. And so the rough command structure that developed was Group of Forces Command, which was a corps headquarters. Below that, the tactical group, which was the brigade headquarters. And below that, even though the tactical group had battalions that were the units that were being given to it, the level of dispersion meant that units were spread out into company positions. And so almost everything devolved into company actions. And so you had corps, brigade, company, basically, as the command structure, Stavka in the central bit. And the other interesting element to this is that because it was very, very difficult to maneuver data out from the front due to jamming, you would tended to have quite a lot of mission command being practiced at the front end, but with multiple echelons looking over the shoulder of those forward units and applying effects in support of their subordinate units without necessarily telling those subordinate units what they were doing. So significant orchestration of fires at the tactical group or combined arms army level using detections that were fed up from the tactical edge. Very rare that the artillery was delegated and organic to things below that kind of tactical group formation. So that's kind of how the Ukrainian military has developed its structures. It works pretty well for defense. It's not so clear that it is a structure optimized for offense. And so if we look at the two offensive operations in Kharkiv and Kherson, both were built around 4 brigades, which were smaller brigade structures with staffs, and they had mission rehearsals and dedicated plans for the axes that each of those was going to operate on. Yet to see how they set up the C2 structure for the offensive, but again, I think it will be different to how they are managing these defensive operations, which are very geographically divided.
You can admire that idea of comms denied environment, using artillery in support of where you think your troops are on the ground, right? But not having communication. But there's a huge danger in that you are best guessing what you're delivering, right?
Well, no, because you're usually observing fall of shot live through UAVs. And what you have is very dense UAV coverage where multiple echelons have their own UAVs in a stack over an area. And so usually the ISR is force generated from the artillery group, which means that they do have a pretty good idea of the fact that they're engaging actual targets and the effect that they're having. What they do not have is understanding of what the tactical commander on the ground is trying to do next, because they can't necessarily get that message. The other thing is that if the UAVs are genuinely blocked and knocked down, and at times the EW environment has pretty much denied whole swathes of the battlefield to it, then you don't have targets. It's very difficult to do reconnaissance. And so in June of last year, for example, the Ukrainians didn't have any targets to hit, that even if they did have artillery in the area, which was fairly scarce in the Donbass at the time.
So having said all that, and particularly with a focus on this denied environment, it's something that has always worried me in terms of EME denial. I mean, where you talk about Western approaches to war, it's all about a dispersed force, it's all about a connected force. These are now the presumptions of what will be present to make a force viable almost in a future war with a peer-on-peer adversary. What did the Ukrainians take away from that? Are there lessons that we could be drawing? Are there observations? I know the Ukrainians are very clear that these are observations. Are there things that we should be taking away to consider and peruse? How did it affect command and control?
It's changed over time, depending on the level of overmatch. So in June of last year in the Donbass, as I say, the level of EW meant that there was virtually no ability to communicate with forward units, no ability to get ISR forward, and the understanding of higher echelons of what was happening further forward was pretty limited. That has changed, partly because as the use of space-based observation and HIMARS knocked out the logistics behind the Russian artillery, and then opened up the ability to start using UAVs, and ISR came back into play, then what you have now is not so much a denied environment as a continually disrupted environment. And that has a number of effects. Firstly, it means that whenever you engage in an activity, you don't know what the latency is going to be between you getting your information back or your UAV returning and you being able to offboard the data. Makes it quite difficult to plan, makes it very difficult to synchronize at scale because different elements of your force are not synchronized based on their capability. They're synchronized based on the level of disruption that they run into. It's also very disorientating because in a lot of exercises, we tend to practice denial, turning systems off. You can't use this, you can't use that. The problem is that that doesn't replicate uncertainty. It replicates a known fact, which is, right, this is denied to me. The experience is that if you don't know whether you're being jammed or not, you don't know whether your orders got through, you don't know whether your situation report got through, then it becomes really, really hard to respond. And so you need pretty good situational awareness in the electromagnetic spectrum. You need to understand which frequencies are available and which ones aren't, which communication systems will work, which ones won't, and move between them, because it's too resource intensive and actually exposes the capabilities too much for the Russians to deny the whole spectrum continuously, unless they have built up, so say, the 20-1 force advantage that they had in the Donbass at that particular period. What's actually quite interesting is the Command Sergeant Major of 18 Corps highlighted that Ukraine's allies have been passing electromagnetic spectrum cut or survey to the Ukrainians, I think 32 times a day. Now, obviously, there's a limited number of troops in the Ukrainian force who know how to read that, but that's the speed at which you need to be able to potentially adjust your comms plan based on what effects are being applied in your sector at that time.
I'm guessing that the Russians, who are pretty good at studying and analysing the EME as well, are looking for those spikes, the things that sit outside of normal civilian operating moments, the sort of white noise that sits in the back. And those spikes, easily geolocated, right, signify effectively a target. You're almost targeting based on the EME.
There's plenty of that. So Russian EME kill chains are about 20 minutes to lock a location and to certify that it is a target and get confidence that it's not a false positive, and then to communicate that to their fires, which means that you need to be able to collapse a headquarters very quickly and to move into hardened positions. In fact, it's better just to have a dispersed headquarters to begin with and have it actually using civcoms, and then it's really, really hard to pick out for most traffic. And then particular traffic, you can use software-defined radios. But if you're using mesh networks, software-defined radios, it becomes much harder to actually pick out individual points in the EME. So there is a virtue to having quite a uniform appearance in the EME rather than having a hyper-specialized set of communications tools that mean that you can pick out the JTAC, you can pick out the command post, etc. So that flattening of equipment is, I think, quite important. But yeah, the Russians are continually targeting based off that. And they also layer those effects. So they will jam you so that you are slower to move off. They will, while you're jammed, prepare the fire mission against the location. And then as you start moving, they will cue loitering munitions, lancets on to find and engage the moving target. So everything becomes a pretty layered problem. And I think this is something that we're seeing across the board. Combined arms activity is getting lower and lower in terms of the echelon at which you need to take into consideration those combined arms effects.
Now, I want to come back in a second, but I do just want to explain to some of the audience who might not be aware, they might not be signals geeks, right? That traditionally the military has a reserved set of frequencies that it operates within. And as governments have sold off more and more of the spectrum to commercial and civilian operators for 3G, 4G, 5G, for television signals, for satellite communications, the military band has got narrower and narrower and is very, very defined, right? You're operating within that. So to jump outside that is very strange for Western operators, but there are some tools out there that have been really successful in delivering that. And some of that stuff where you blend into the white noise then allows you to pass data as well, and not simply what the military used to rely on, which was voice concept. That's particularly what Jack was talking about. So listen, it strikes me when you're talking about that it feels quite reminiscent of the C2 setup, of the way the sort of IRGC operated. At the same time, lots of delegation, strategic support for some discrete elements, but otherwise commanders were told off to go and raise merry hell here, there, or anywhere else. I don't think it's a deliberate crossover, right, of knowledge, but it's interesting in the way that different actors have evolved command and control sets that feel quite similar. Do you think that's a very crude comparison, or do you think that there are some similarities that come out?
I think that militaries that are overmatched tend to converge upon a fairly limited range of techniques that are robust in the face of that overmatch. And the IRGC obviously was facing US collection, which is going to be a pretty decisive shaper of how you behave. The Ukrainians are very open in acknowledging that while they're not overmatched in terms of their technical expertise by the Russians, they're completely overmatched in terms of the scale and intensity of EW capability. And so they are adopting some similar behaviors. I think it's important, though, that we don't exaggerate the extent to which the Ukrainians are operating in a manner that's completely different from the Russians. Ukrainian military culture, I would suggest, has evolved slower from its Soviet roots than Ukrainian civil culture. And what's happened to a large extent is the military in Ukraine has absorbed a huge amount of civilians with no real military experience. That has significantly diluted and changed how the military operates, because you actually have civilians doing a lot of these functions. And so they're very creative. They're also very chaotic and not as structured. The military side of things, actually, there are a lot of holdovers from the Soviet approach. And also you end up with a dearth of junior officers in a lot of positions. And so I was observing a deputy corps commander, for example, last time I was in Ukraine, teaching section attacks because he felt that it had to be done properly and he knew how it was done. And he was very good. But there is also an element here of higher echelon commanders will exercise a lot of control because they're trying to achieve combat management, and because actually that is where the experience is in parts of the Ukrainian military. And so they'll try and pass on that knowledge, but it does draw them down into tactical activity.
Now, listen, one of the reports you've recently brought out is how the Russians have evolved. And you and I have talked before about Russian command and control. We've seen how many Russian generals have been killed. We've seen disastrous operations in terms of throwing their troops into combat operations without any preparation or ISR or even training in some cases. The Russians are evolving there. Are they evolving in C2 as well as tactics?
So their forms and methods are changing. They are for example, shifting away from battalion tactical group structures into these kind of mission orientated or task generated storm detachments or assault detachments, which are battalion sized groupings, but their composition is mission dependent. However, what you seem to have is a combined arms army headquarters, which is 120 kilometers back. They have their own collection methods. They will be plugged in via the telecommunications cable to the brigade headquarters, which will command a sector and have its artillery group and UAVs. Below that, you'll have field cables and microlinks connecting that to the battalion headquarters. And then below that, unencrypted open comms across the battalion, which is essentially the storm detachment. Storm detachment will have its own UAS up, and the commander will largely remain in their command post and observe. So you will have Russian infantry doing their thing, and there will be UAVs sitting above them, which is basically the commander watching what their people are doing and giving them instructions based on what they're seeing with their other UAVs in terms of what the enemy is doing. And then above that, you will have higher echelon UAVs where you'll have the brigade commander doing exactly the same thing. So you often have a really long screwdriver in the Russian system plugged into the back of even sections, which isn't a hugely effective way of doing things. You also have very, very little collaboration between boundaries or across boundaries. So when you have two assault detachments operating side by side, they won't help each other out. And if they see something, it will often go back up the chain and then back down rather than across. So I would say the Russians are adapting in terms of how they manage their system, and they're getting much more proficient at things like their reconnaissance fires complex. It's more resilient. It's got more links in it, or rather more capabilities linked into it, but they are not moving away from their culture.
And what about other militaries in other parts of the world, particularly those that have been in combat? And I'm thinking perhaps Libya or Yemen or Syria. What can we expect from the Chinese? I mean, are other people looking at this and learning, or do we think that these are very context-specific lessons against a peer? And that what we're seeing in the rest of the world, whether it's Azerbaijan and Armenia or others, are they learning other lessons?
I think we can definitely learn lessons about control in large-scale conflict and what it takes to deliver control. One of the things that I would observe of both the Russian and the Ukrainian military is the criticality of lieutenants, captains, and platoon sergeants in maintaining tempo of movement, right? Like basic tactical drills, like managing fire, for example, control of fire, so that you can suppress a position while having people move up onto it. Actually something that unless you practice again and again and again and again, it's really hard to do and to coordinate without slowing down as soon as you start moving into friction. And that is something that professional militaries are good at, and that a lot of militias and non-state groups and militaries that have had a large part of their professional personnel killed really struggle at, because they just can't drill their people that way. And what that leads to is a very attritional fight where it's difficult to take ground. So it highlights some real important sinews to make control effective. It's certainly in the control of fires. I think you can transpose it over to other theaters, and people are looking at this in a similar way in terms of how they can apply it, particularly when it comes to tools, right? So the Ukrainian application system for control of fire is very intuitive, tablet-based, just dropping pins and populating targets back for guns to then service those orders, essentially. I think a lot of people are looking at that and saying, this is very intuitive and a sensible way to go. Similarly, Strelets, which is the Russian primary C2 tool for transferring reconnaissance detections, the architecture and the way that that works is something that's bearer agnostic. It will ingest multiple feeds and disseminate them, that a lot of people are aspiring to build and get to. So I think you can see commonalities there. Command, different, very different. And I think the thing that's reinforced in my mind again and again, not just in this conflict, but in many other contexts, is that command is culturally specific. And there is a problem, I think, in the NATO mindset, particularly the US, but the Brits do it too, of basically trying to say that, and that you see this in statements made about Ukraine, you know, the Ukrainians are beating the Russians insofar as they have evolved their command culture to be more like ours. And that's not true at all. the Ukrainian culture and approach to command is very Ukrainian. And it works because of the social connections between people and how authority works within their cultural structure. If you try and transpose an American command culture onto British units, it wouldn't work very well. Imagine British officers trying to command French troops. There would be all sorts of frictions based on just how people behave and how people relate to those in authority. And so I think there we have to be very, very cautious about assuming that there is a model of what good command looks like. There are some principles of command that are consistent and that are good, empowering your subordinates, being clear about your intent, etc. But actually what that looks like on the ground is going to be very, very dependent upon the society that you're building that command structure from.
So one of the issues that I think is coming up is that how command and control interrelate is an issue, even if some of the lessons in terms of control, the technical systems that allow you to do that, cross over. The evolution of those systems has not been deliberate, right? We've not thought about this is how we want it and this is how it relates to command. It's almost been like, we like that bit of kit, let's use it, let's integrate it in the way we can. Do you have a view on how command and control as interrelated practices are going to evolve? Do we need to think more about how command is going to change based on the control measures? Or do you think that command is so culturally and contextually specific that actually it's very hard to make sweeping generalizations about the relationship between the two?
I think it's quite interesting that when people talk about the future of war and they are very focused on artificial intelligence and its implications, it's very, very easy to draw out what that means for the exercise of control. We already have examples of, say, naval integrated fire control counter-air, where you have a very well-designed structure for controlling those effects and optimizing exactly how a combination of sensors and weapons engage with a threat. But people often conflate that with then being able to apply it to the conduct of command. And I think it's much harder to envisage or read across what implications that will have on command. The one that I see a lot is that commanders become sucked ever closer into the tactical fight by these systems, because even when they are at core depth, they can see and reach out and touch tactical activity, and they have a view about whether that howitzer should be engaging that target. And maybe they have more information at their echelon, and therefore actually they're right. That howitzer isn't the best one that's placed to engage the target that it happens to be assigned against. But when you have a corps commander who is being pulled into those sorts of questions because they can see it and because they can exercise control, and people like being in control, then they're not actually thinking about their command function, which is what happens next week, what happens next month, what's the morale of my troops, what is my judgment about whether reserves are pushed in or whether they're withheld. If they're withheld and the troops ahead are calling for support because I know what's going to happen next week, how do I communicate to those personnel that are asking for help that it's not coming without them feeling abandoned? And how do I make sure that they trust my judgment? Those are very human things. And I don't think technology gets you out of most of those problems. In fact, if you gain the capacity to be too in control, I think it very easily crowds out your ability to execute command.
The final area I wanted to talk to you about, Jack, specifically with regards to Ukraine, is political command and control, or the political military relationship, which is certainly part of the way we perhaps academically consider the political military relationship. It's not been without its tension in Ukraine, as it should be anywhere. I mean, you could say that's a healthy tension. It seems to have worked out well. There's been, in every overseas engagement that the West has had, I think there's been some tensions between political and military command and control. It's not just in rules of engagement, but it's in interpretation of the mission. Remember David Richards in Sierra Leone having a different interpretation over perhaps what his political masters were saying back in the UK. Ukraine is a really interesting example of this, right? Because, there are various pressures that the political masters, particularly President Zelensky, has been under from the West about delivering success, not continuing to lose very well and lose slowly, but turning it on its head. That command and control relationship between political leaders and military leaders, how does that stand in Ukraine? Is it a what we'd recognize as a Western model? Is it a Soviet model? Is it something in between? What does it look like?
There are a number of pressures in Ukraine. One of them is that the presidential administration is very eager to centralize authorities and likes to be in control of what's going on. And they feel, I think, that there are some very, very high stakes issues that require you to be in the circle of knowledge to be able to exercise judgment on. In particular, things like their relationship with international partners, which if that breaks down, then Ukraine can't continue this fight alone. They can't afford to, and they don't have the munitions for it. And so that is strategically an imperative. That creates a lot of tensions because there's so much activity going on that you can't centralize all of the activity that needs to happen. It's just not viable. So there's always this tension between decentralized activity and centralized activity, and between competing logics. The military logic, tactical military logic, would have told you to withdraw from Bakhmut some time ago. You know, the battlefield geometry had become very unfavorable. There were better positions to fall back to. And in terms of the resource exchange, it was becoming less favorable. And so many Ukrainian tactical commanders were of the view that actually Bakhmut is not very operationally important. I was with the Ukrainian ambassador a couple of days ago. He said, you know, its loss doesn't have any particular effect because it's not of military tactical significance. But there was a wider strategic logic to holding it. One of them was to cognitively encourage the Russians to fix themselves on this objective so that they threw in their reserves. And another reason for doing it was so that when the Russians very foolishly commenced their offensive immediately out of winter, the headlines in the West were not Russia goes on the offensive and seizes major objective, which could well have shaped people's perception of the conflict and how it was going in a manner that would have been very detrimental, I think, to the willingness of countries to support Ukraine, which has now happened, and long-term support as well. And so you had a tension between strategic and tactical imperatives. And both arguments are completely valid. You could have fought it either way. But the judgment was made to hold Bakhmut, which was, as I say, a completely reasonable conclusion and has paid off. So there's always these debates, depending on what echelon you're looking at the problem from. And the important thing, the challenge, is to make sure that when there are disagreements, everyone feels like you've taken their position into consideration and people understand why the decision went against them so that they don't lose confidence. That's the really critical thing. So it just requires continuous dialogue.
Jack, we've run out of time. Listen, thanks so much for coming on the show. Your insights are really valuable in this conversation. I hope you manage some rest before you depart on the next leg of your travels. You can read more of Jack's work and thinking at RUSI.org. It's worth doing his back catalogue as well as his latest pieces, some excellent reports on Ukraine, because of the brilliant analysis that there is prior to 2022, when apparently, according to lots of people, the world changed irrecoverably. The paper he edited on heresies is one of my personal favourites. It's prescient too. As I say, you can find it at www.rusi.org. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Systematic. Join your partners and allies already using our cutting-edge C4 ISR sit-aware suite.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about the show, please do subscribe and leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us reach new audiences and spread the word. You might want to send us some questions too. We're running a live panel at DSEI in September in London, where I attempt to get an all-star cast to answer at least some of them. Do come along and meet the team then. This episode is produced by Aurelius Lab as a show for the Wavell Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.